for them. 12. So Shabti are associated with bonded labor, but historians speculate that there was some sort of choice for the Shabti. In the slave market, bonded laborers were commonly sold with a slave yoke or a taming stick to show that slave was troublesome. 13. This specific type of weaponry to torture the slave has many local names in Egyptian documents, but the preferred term is called shaba. There are other forms of restraint used in ancient Egypt slave markets more common than the shbia, like ropes and cords. Forced labor. Several departments in the ancient Egyptian government were able to draft workers from the general population to work for the state with a corvée labor system. The laborers were conscripted for projects such as military expeditions, mining and quarrying, and construction projects for the state. These slaves were paid a wage, depending on their skill level and social status for their work. Conscripted workers were not owned by individuals, like other slaves, but rather required to perform labor as a duty to the state. Conscripted labor was a form of taxation by government officials and usually happened at the local level when high officials called upon small village leaders. 9. 14. Masters. Masters of ancient Egypt were under obligations when owning slaves. Masters were allowed to utilize the abilities of their slaves by employing them in different manners, including domestic services, cooks, maids, nannies, etc., and labor services, gardeners, stable hands, field hands, etc. Masters also had the right to force the slave to learn a trade or craft to make the slave more valuable. Masters were forbidden to force child slaves to harsh physical labor. 9. Economy. Ancient Egypt was a peasant-based economy, and it was not until the Greco-Roman period that slavery had a greater impact. Slave dealing in ancient Egypt was done through private dealers and not through a public market. The transaction had to be performed before a local council or officials with a document containing clauses that were used in other valuable sales. However, pharaohs were able to bypass this, and possess it power to give slaves to any they saw fit, usually being a vizier or noble. 9. 14. Slave life. Many slaves who worked for temple estates lived under punitive conditions, but on average the ancient Egyptian slave led a life similar to a serf. They were capable of negotiating transactions and owning personal property. Chattel and debt slaves were given food but probably not given wages. Egyptian slaves, specifically during the New Kingdom era, originated from foreign lands. The slavist hemselves were seen as an accomplishment to Egyptian king's reign, and a sign of power. Slaves or bake were seen as property or a commodity to be bought and sold. Their human qualities were disregarded and were merely seen as property to be used for a master's labor. Unlike the more modern term, serf, Egyptian slaves were not tied to the land. The owner, could use the slave for various occupational purposes. The slaves could serve towards the productivity of the region and community. Slaves were generally men. Butomen and families could be forced into the owner's household service. 5. The fluidity of a slave's occupation does not translate to freedom. It is difficult to use the word free as a term to describe slaves' political or social independence due to the lack of sources and material from Byzantine time period. 11. Much of the research conducted on Egyptian enslavement has focused on the issue of payment to slaves. Masters did not commonly pay their slaves a regular wage for their service or loyalty. The slaves worked so that they could either enter Egypt and hope for a better life, receive compensation of living quarters and food, or be granted admittance to work in the afterlife. 12. Although slaves were not free or rightfully independent, slaves in the New Kingdom were able to leave their master if they had a justifiable grievance. Historians have read documents about situations where this could be a possibility, but it is still uncertain if independence from slavery was attainable. 5. Great Pyramids not built by slaves. There is a consensus among Egyptologists that the Great Pyramids were not built by slaves. 15, 16, 17. According to noted archaeologists Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, the pyramids were not built by slaves. Hawass's archaeological discoveries in the 1990s in Cairo show the workers were paid laborers, rather fans laughs. 18, 16, 19, 20. Rather, it was farmers who built the pyramids during flooding, when they could not work their lands. 21, 22, 16, 23. The allegation that Israelite slaves built the pyramids was first made by Jewish historian Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews during the 1st century CE, an account that was subsequently popularized during the Renaissance period. 24. While the idea that the Israelites served as slaves in Egypt features in the Bible, scholars generally agree that the story constitutes an origin myth rather than a historical reality. 25, 16. But the fact that the Bible's depiction of Israelite servitude accords with what it is known about slavery in ancient Egypt has convinced some scholars that the story probably has some historical basis. 26, 27. In any case, the construction of the pyramids does not appear in the biblical story. 24. Modern archaeologists consider that the Israelites were indigenous to Canaan and never resided in ancient Egypt in significant numbers. 28. See also Slavery in the Bible. References: Shaw, G.J. 2012.